Welcome to another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. And today we're going to continue our series reading through my newsletter, my article on how to change the world. I'm sorry, a new story of humanity, you know, a compendium of how to change the world for the better. Um, and this has been a very interesting, read through has allowed me to, share my thoughts that I was going through when I was writing this. So, this section we're going to talk about a brief aside about language. Last section we talked about why we can change the environment in terms of why we can change in terms of the environment. And so since this is a short section, probably going to go straight into the next one of how we adapt to the environment. But let's get right into it. So brief aside about language. It is not that the ape or the wolf is some violent, untamed creature. It is simply a creature. It responds in certain ways depending on the conditions and its available tools, its culture, and so on. We may see the way it rips apart another animal as violent, and we may see that violence as a bad thing, but that is our own interpretation and subjective opinion. We use language to try and understand the world, but that does not mean our language is always an accurate description or even always a useful one. Furthermore, even if our definition of something like violence is useful in describing what we perceive, the accompanying moralistic values we place upon that word and perception is yet another layer of opinion. Viewing all kinds of violence as a bad thing is like viewing all kinds of liquids as a good thing. Yes, there are some good liquid for us, such as blood or water, but many liquids are poisonous or dangerous to us, including blood and many types of water. Likewise, violence is only a useful concept if it is in reference to us directly and in certain other contexts. Our language is very useful, but what we do with that language can be very counterproductive and even dangerous if used in the wrong context. There is no inherent evil or otherwise sinful natures in the world, and viewing the world that way encourages you to ignore the role the environment plays on how things behave. It also leads you to justify really bad behavior in the name of righteousness. When we say human nature, we have to be clear about what we mean. We usually mean what humans do naturally. How do we behave in our natural habitat? Turns out that depends on the habitat. All right. So just real quick, if you recall, I touched on this thing of violence specifically because that's something we use a lot in terms of all humans are inherently violent, stuff like that. Okay, but what does that mean? Right? We tend to get caught up too much in our language sometimes, and I know that's a kind of contentious point because people will be like, "Oh, language is important. How else are we going to communicate with each other?" And they're right, but it still doesn't it still needs to we still need to talk about how language itself is a construct, obviously, right? But you would think, but unfortunately, when people, like, for instance, violence, right? When people say, "Oh, violence is this thing because this is how we defined it," right? Um, the way in which we defined it may be wrong, right? Because we may have an idea of what we mean by violence, and we have this definition to try and communicate that meaning, right? But that meaning and that definition may not accurately describe what we actually mean when we say violence, right? Because usually when we say violence, we mean that in a specific context, right? We mean it when we're talking about interpersonal, actions and things like that. When you use something like violence in terms to a creature like a wolf or a lion or even like a plant or whatever, like if you go into the definition of violence here, right? We'll break this down a little bit. So maybe we won't go into the next section. um, I'm looking at here. I'm sorry, I realized I didn't share my entire screen. Share just the tab. Here we go. So it says violent here is marked by the use or usually harmful or destructive physical force, showing or including violence, extremely powerful or forceful and capable of causing damage. Right. So it seems like an easy thing. Like, okay, obviously wolves can be violent and all this other stuff, causing or intending to cause damage, injury, or death, often when involving great force. Right. So all of this just seems to make sense. But The problem is, like what I stated before, it may not be the definition itself. It may be our second layer, right? Our moralistic kind of layer on top of that, right? When people hear violence, they often think of usually intention or usually like some essence or something like that, right? Um, and a lot of people just don't really think about it enough. And because of that, when somebody else uses that term of violence in different contexts, then they can be manipulated to think a certain way about that violence. And that goes for pretty much anything, any word, right? There's a lot of other examples I could probably point to. But the reason, again, I want to point this out is because we have to be very careful about how and where and when we use language. And if we don't ever think about how it's used, and we just think it's just the truth of the universe, then we can be very easily misled. Another great example, I'm not sure if I talked about it here, but like is a term animal, right? We often use the term animal to point to other things rather than ourselves, like other species on this earth. When in reality, we are an animal just as much as, an ape or a lion or whatever. The only difference is that we can communicate with each other and we can talk to each other. And it gets to a point where we kind of assume that all other animals are in this box and they can communicate with each other, and then we're over here and we're superior and we're better, and but we can't talk to all of them, right? It's kind of silly, but that's how a lot of us view it, right? Another case is nature. That one's especially egregious case, similar to the animal thing, where we think of ourselves outside of nature. We think of our technology unnatural, right? Outside of nature, when in reality it is nature. It's just our own manipulation. It's like how we manipulate nature. Um, but that goes into some other stuff. I'll go ahead and continue though. Human nature is however we adapt to an environment. Realizing that we, just like every other animal and life form, respond to our environment inherently helps you see that we can, in fact, change. Simply because if and when the environment changes, so must we. In other words, as our natural habitat changes, we can change along with it. Once again, it is important to realize that the environment is not just the physical surroundings and conditions, but also the incorporeal, yet still very real, social, mental, emotional, and other ones too. Every life form can change its environment, though to what extent depends. It seems that the more intelligent a creature is, the more it can perceive non physical environments, such as simulations of future environments or the creation of social environments in your mind through the interactions of other beings. That intelligence allows it to use that ability to change its environment more consciously, right? The unique thing about humans is that we can create these non-physical environments more than any other creature and then respond to them. Our ability to think is the very process of creating and or responding to non-physical environments. We perceive the world, then we compare our perceptions with past perceptions to simulate future possibilities, future environments. We then respond accordingly to maximize our benefits. We can even change the current environment quite drastically to more closely match our simulated environments in which we think we would respond, live more desirably. Um, Before I go on, so yeah, this is a interesting point. Excuse me, because this comes from what I was learning about the neocortex and how the mind works. The mind, like the neocortex, is essentially a simulation machine, right? All it does, that's or I should probably say the prefrontal cortex, right? I believe I might be wrong. We can double check, I suppose. Um, as the neocortex. Large part of the cerebral cortex make up probably have the positive responsible neural computations, attention, thought, perception, episode. Yeah. So basically, it's like a simulation machine, right? The computations of attention, thought, perception, and episodic memory. So what that means is when you see something, right, it puts it in a space where you can, put it sequentially, right? You create a timeline of events that every time you see something, and it's stored right in other parts of the brain that allows you to call back to it, like memory, right? And that allows you to form to not just store it like in the past, but then to call back to that memory and think about how it could have changed. That's why every time we recall a memory, we're actually changing the memory based on your current perceptions. And that today, unfortunately, means it's very um, imprecise to use your memory in a court of law, things like that, because it changes every time you kind of look back to it. But it's very powerful as a simulation machine, as a method of taking data from the world and then manipulating that to see how things could have done differently and things like that. So it's a very powerful tool for simulations. um we perceive the world, then we compare our perceptions with. I read that. Sorry. Even if you disagree with the deterministic bias I am so obviously using, you should still be able to see the massive benefits of recognizing the impact of the environments we perceive, physically and non-physically, on our lives. And maybe that wasn't as clear as I was making it, but basically, I'm calling this deterministic because what I'm saying here is that the different environments that we live in largely determine our decisions and our thoughts and our emotions and things like that, right? Not just your physical environment, but again, your social, cultural, emotional, all these other things, all these different places in which we live really constrain or really, help decide, what we do, what we think about on a day-to-day basis. To bring it back once again, we do not have some inherent human nature. We simply are responding and living in accordance with whatever environments we perceive for ourselves. Or perhaps human nature is inherently social, and anything beyond that is an application of that social behavior within various environments. If we want to change, we have to recognize that not only can we change, but we are always changing. We are always responding to many different environments, but it is easy to assume that we're not changing and can't do so because we're constantly manipulating the environment to become the same, to encourage the same type of behaviors that we happen to value at that moment. There's a huge catch to this overpowered ability to mold the balance in our favor, though. We don't actually know what is best for us, at least not always. Oftentimes, we either lose sight of our own intuition of what is good for us, and or we buy into what somebody else thinks is a good environment for us, regardless of our own needs and desires. Combined, we can all too easily create for ourselves environments that aren't actually to our individual or even collective advantage, at least not in the long term. We can fool ourselves into thinking we have mastered the environment when really we just put something in motion that will come back to then will snap us into oblivion. So it's a fun way to end that. But yeah, just to recap the whole thing, what I'm saying here is that, um, we tend to think of ourselves kind of a masters in the environment, masters of our world. We're creating a better world for us. But in reality, oftentimes, since we're not really thinking about how the environment impacts us and how our changes come back to us, right? Then we are making all these mistakes. We're throwing things all around the environment, and then, building our own cage of thought, for instance, right? You may have heard the terms and phrases like, we build. I forget the exact, but something along the lines of like we build the cages in which we live in, stuff like that, right? And that's very true, right? And what I was saying here with this paragraph about how we can encourage the same type of behaviors with different environments is that we live in an environment, right? And then we get to a kind of a what I'm going to talk about next, local maximum. We get to a point where we feel like we're in a good spot, and then we change the environment constantly to revert us back to this spot. And it seems like a good thing, right? It seems like we're just living comfortably, right? But as we know today, like I'm sitting down and it's a comfortable position. But actually, if you sit down too much, and what most of us do, our entire body degrades. And so the more we, you know, need to pay attention to this stuff, the more we sit down, for instance, and are in this environment of sedentariness, the weaker our body gets. And so the more important it is to realize that we need to stand up and move around some more and go back to the environment that we had before, or encourage a new environment in which we're, have standing desks or treadmills at our desks or something, right? Get more sunlight, get more air, get more, we, we're realizing now that a lot of the environment that we built for ourselves is not really a healthy and a great good one. But yeah, I'll end it there for today. As always, let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you've got from this. If you agree, disagree, whatever, love to have discussions about it. Shout out to the folks that have been in my comments so far. Really grateful for that. Had some great discussions already. So yeah, thanks and have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.